Marjorie, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I wanted to ask Marjorie, there's this concept of capital bias that you've recently been working on, this dilemma, which you've described as the core value around which the current system is organized. In your own words, how would you describe capital bias to someone who hadn't heard this expression before?
We, as a society, we understand the idea of racial bias. We understand gender or sex bias, but we don't yet have language for capital bias. Mm-hmm. And this works in a very similar way. It's both attitudes and institutions that serve one group at the expense of another. And in the case of capital bias, it's attitudes and institutions that favor those who have money. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, in a way, it's kind of obvious, right?
Right.
But if you look at it in some kind of systematic way, you can say, well, what is the business reporting in our culture? It's the Wall Street Journal, right? It's not the labor market journal. Wall Street is considered, the capital of economics, and it's all about finance. Where you look at who has the power inside corporations, who elects the board of corporations. Well, it's capital. It's not workers. I mean, workers go there every day and do the work of the place, but they're not considered members of corporate society in the same way that women or blacks at one time were not considered full members of American society. So there's discrimination. You look at financial statements, which for most people are Greek, but basically the bottom line is income for capital holders. That's the aim of a company, is to maximize income for capital holders and minimize income to labor.
Right.
It's called holding down costs. But you define income to workers as a cost. You define income to capital as profit. Mm-hmm. So one is bad, one is good.
Right.
And that's all built in.
Right.
In the same way that we used to talk about mankind. Male bias, gender bias was built into how we even thought about history, how we thought about leadership. It seemed normal that every president of the United States has always been a man. Well, that's a result of gender bias, So there's and they interrelate to gender, race bias, capital bias. But it's an attempt to name something that I think we all know is there, but actually is a very specific phenomenon, which has specific ways that it is carried out.
Interesting. While you're talking, it occurs to me that one form of this capital bias is something that one of the Next System co-chairs, Gus Speth, talks about it a lot, is the indicators we use. It being like GDP. Our main concern is like that, this output grows. Meanwhile, it's not really connected to the well-being of, the things that the Wall Street Journal, as you would say, aren't really caring about.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so GDP is, carries this implicit bias toward growth. Mm-hmm. More is better. That's built into the whole notion of GDP. Well, profit carries an implicit bias that more money for wealthy people is good.
Right.
The stock market is supposed to go up. That means more money for wealthy people. Right. More than 70% of all the stock in the stock market is held by the richest 10%. So every night on the wall, when we hear about the rise and fall of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, we're hearing about the performance of rich people's investment portfolios.
Sure.
And we're led to believe, well, that means the economy is doing well.
Right. There's a lot of people thinking through the intensification of economic inequality in the economy. But rather than economic equality, you suggest that framing the problem through the lens of capital bias is more direct and more effective. What do you mean by this?
Yeah. Well, inequality is a great word as far as it goes. Mm-hmm. I mean, what I like about the word inequality is it says in one word this massive problem that we finally started to talk about. We didn't used to talk about it. We used to talk about poverty, which is different than inequality because it's broader. But what inequality lacks is any notion of causation. Mm-hmm. Where does inequality come from? It's kind of like the weather or something. It's like, well, it's just more inequality, but we don't have a sense of where it comes from. And what capital bias suggests is that the increasing wealth of some is actually causally related to the lowering income of others. Now, that's not something that we talk about very much. but they are related, and the reason is capital bias.
Right. It's interesting because it implies from the jump that this is a system problem when you're describing it as
That's right.
kind of like economic inequality as an outcome and capital bias as the actual motor. Kind of.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's the deep values-based, sort of in the human heart motivator, and that's where so much of this. That's where this all begins.
Right.
Yeah. And I don't, it's not like a competition. My word's better than the other word. We need lots of words.
Sure.
Think about all the words we have for money. We have capital, we have rent, we have equity, we have debt. I mean, you look up in the thesaurus how many words we have for money, and it's staggering.
Yeah.
Well, we need more words to describe inequality and what causes it and what's going on.
Right. You suggest that beyond economic disparities, that the capital bias is related to is, if not one of the key drivers of racism and sexism. I was wondering if you could elaborate your understanding of the connection there.
Yeah, I don't think I would say capital bias is actually a driver of racism or sexism, but I would say they're all intertwined, and it's helpful to look at it historically, because when you go back to the monarchy and an aristocratic society, which used to be pretty much all over the world from the dawn of time.
In one form or another.
Yeah, you had it in Egypt, you had it in China. I mean, you had it in different forms. A few exceptions among indigenous peoples. But for the most part, it was the global paradigm for millennia. And intertwined, there was this notion that certain people are better than others, and they rule by right, by divine right, in many cases. People said, and so who were those people? Well, they were men. They were mostly white, and they were rich. And then they were also called noble. They had blue blood, right? We've gotten rid of that idea, at least.
Yeah. I like to think so.
But it was all intertwined. And there's this wonderful book that I read. I think it was called Keeping the Lower Orders in Their Places. But this was something that Edmund Burke said at the very dawn of the Enlightenment and the notion of democracy, which was this shocking new idea. The conservative idea, which had ruled for millennia, suddenly had to articulate itself. It had never had to. It never needed an ideology because it just was the way the world was.
Right.
But it suddenly needed to articulate itself, and Edmund Burke said, well, the lower orders must be kept in their places. You could actually say these things in those days. And the lower orders were explicitly understood to include women, blacks, Jews, and workers. Those were the lower orders. And they must all be kept in their places because otherwise society was at risk. And so, one by one, we've been peeling away these biases. We've been saying, well, no, maybe it isn't right to discriminate against Jews. We certainly learned that in World War II. We learned the horror of where that kind of thinking leads.
Right.
We learned at great, we had to go to war over it, that, no, enslaving black people is not a reasonable way to run a society.
Right.
And we're still learning unpeeling the lessons of that. We learned that women deserve a vote. Women are human beings too. What a radical concept. And so one by one, we're starting to pierce these biases and say, no, maybe that's the way the world always has been, but maybe it doesn't make any sense. Okay? So there's a final bias that we have not yet peeled away. We have not yet looked directly at it, and it's capital bias, which says wealthy people are more important than everybody else. They deserve more rights. They deserve more power, and all the wealth that they have is deserved and is legitimate. Right. Now, it's a very scary thing if you start to say maybe that's not true. So how are they related? That was your question. You have to start from the premise that the wealth of capitalism rests to a large extent on extraction from people of color. Where did the wealth of Europe and Western countries come from? Well, a lot of it came from colonies. Africa was colonized. It was treated as a plantation, basically, of wealthy people back home. And extracting wealth was the aim. The people themselves were treated as property. And the whole wealth of Southern society rested on slavery. And so it's a really painful thing to look at.
Right.
That how much of the wealth of our society really began with extraction from people of color, and that continues to today. I mean, you look at the housing bust in 2008, 2009. People of color lost homes at a far greater rate. Their wealth collapsed. I mean, basically, equity was extracted from their homes.
Yeah.
To a far greater extent than white people. Now, so when you look at that and you say, was it extracted because they were people of color? What I think of it as, I think that wealth extraction is now willing to extract from anybody. If you're low income, they don't really care what color you are if they can get some money off of you.
Right.
And I think that the way that racism today interacts with capital bias is that if you're vulnerable in any way, you're more susceptible to extraction. If you don't understand how to read a credit card statement, if you don't understand that the mortgage you're signing might be an abusive one,
mm-hmm.
you don't have a lawyer to support you, you don't know how to understand the documents, you're subject to extraction. Now, whether you're poor white or poor black, the system is a little bit indifferent to that.
Right.
It really is mostly interested in just financial extraction.
Right.
That's what I'd say. In a way, extraction has become an equal opportunity.
Sure. Well,
Fact.
Well, in your book, Owning Our Future, you juxtapose extraction with, I suppose you might say generation or generative design.
Yeah.
How is, would you say, extractive design related to this concept of capital bias?
Yeah. Well, in my book, Owning Our Future, what I'm trying to point out is that there are different ways to design ownership.
Mm-hmm.
We don't think of ownership as having a design. We think of it as a fact, right?
Yeah.
You own something or you don't. Well, in fact, ownership is a bundle of rights that can be distributed in different ways, and they can be designed in different ways. I look, for example, at indigenous peoples owning the forests of Mexico. And because these are people who live in the forests, they have a vested interest in keeping the forest standing and keeping it thriving. And so they found that there's less illegal harvesting of forests when you have indigenous people owning the forest, because they live in the forest. They're watching for this illegal harvesting. I found the same thing in Maine when I look at lobster. The lobster industry, you have only owner-occupied boats can fish in sensitive inner waters, and you have to catch lobster using traps. You can't use like big nets. You can't just like trawl the ocean bottom and destroy the habitat and take up all the lobster. So there's no lobster ever in the future. Mm. That's outlawed. And so, extractive harvesting of lobster is not permitted. And ownership design, only the small owner-occupied boats can be there, not the big corporate-owned boats that go out deep. And so ownership design contributes to this, what I call generative. It's generative design. It creates the conditions for life to thrive. Mm-hmm. Whereas, the big corporate boats that are just trying to extract everything, they would actually destroy the conditions for life. So I'm trying to say there's extractive design and there's generative design. I had to make up a word because there isn't. There aren't words for either of these, so I made up both of those words. Now, extractive, people like and they use. Generative hasn't caught on as much. Like, these days, I call it more democratic.
Okay.
I'm still searching. We're all searching for the language.
Everyone loves democracy.
Yeah, democracy's good. So the difference between extractive and generative design, extractive design, it's aimed at maximum extraction of financial income. That's its aim. And so it's driven by capital bias, which says basically that financial wealth matters more than anything else, including living wealth, and that people who hold financial wealth deserve more power than others. Therefore, their aims predominate inside whatever entity you have, whether it's a company or whatever. And so that's how capital bias gives rise to extractive design.
Sure. And it seems like this kind of thesis of your book is that you're identifying ownership as the kind of intervention point in this system of extraction, as kind of the fulcrum or the turning point toward a more generative system. Yeah,
and it's very unlikely, I think, for many people. We don't understand. Most of us, can't stand to read the Wall Street Journal or don't really want to understand how to read financial statements. It's this kind of, Greek to me kind of phenomenon. And we don't understand that that's really where the action is in the economy. And so when you look at it, and I know that, my colleague Gar Alpovitz says the same thing, is that any economy throughout history its foundational design is ownership. If you had the monarchy and aristocratic society, you had the landed class. Mm-hmm. Land was the property that mattered, that created value because it was an agricultural age. And so owning the land was where economic power lay. So you had land was owned by the aristocracy and the monarchy. In the industrial age, value creation began to be industry and factories. And so you had the robber barons owning the factories, owning the railroads. And so that's the early stage of kind of robber baron capitalism. And then ownership shifted into the stock market. So you no longer had families owning it. Now it was held in the stock market. And so wealth became financialized. And we're in an era now of financialization where the real power is with finance. In socialism, you have state control of enterprise. So each kind of economy, its most fundamental characteristic is the design of ownership. Mm-hmm. And so to shift from one paradigm of ownership to another is foundational to creating a new economy. It's a slower way of working. It's not as fast as let's create a minimum wage or a $15, minimum wage. It's not as fast. So you need other things too. But foundationally, if you want a different economy that's designed for different outcomes in a stable and ongoing way, it's going to involve different kind of ownership.
Right. Well, this brings us, I think, quite naturally to worker ownership, which is something you've documented in a lot of your work. It's something that I think you still work on a majority of your time today on worker ownership. So what is unique about the paradigm of worker ownership as opposed to, because I think a lot of people would have kind of as a premise that, we even, it's part of kind of maybe the Orwellian sense of our economy. We call it a free market. Mm-hmm. But we would have a sense that, we are free enough in this economy, and the sense that the ownership should be distributed and democratized in that sense, that wouldn't occur to a lot of people. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering how you would kind of describe worker ownership as this critical paradigm that you've come to believe in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Back in 1776 in the U.S., we began the process of democratizing politics. We have never democratized economics. It used to be that the whole world was knit together. In the monarchy, they had all the social power, they had all the economic power, they had all the political power. Those have become separate spheres. We've never democratized economics, and we don't think about democracy as having any business being in the economy. We think, no, democracy is over here. That's part of government. And the economy just sort of is what it is. And the wealthy people own everything, and we just think that's normal. And so why does worker ownership matter? So let's start from the point of view of families. One of the things that John Barrows said to us, and he's the head of economic development in Boston, he said, it takes a job to get out of poverty. It takes assets to stay out of poverty. Something like 47% of Americans today cannot put together $400 in an emergency. Now think about that. You break your ankle, your tire goes flat, your kid needs a school band uniform. Whatever. You can think of a million reasons that you might need $400. And to think that, many Americans cannot put together $400. That's scary. Yeah. You would live in a state of kind of, I think, economic anxiety pretty much all the time. Is that a good life? Is that the life of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? It's not. That's a terrible quality of life. So most of us don't think about assets. Most of us don't understand the difference between income and assets. An asset is something that has enduring value and that can actually generate wealth over time. It's different than just a hit of income, which can start or stop. And so if workers own an enterprise, they're much less likely to lay themselves off. You know, they're much less likely to outsource their jobs to China.
Sure.
They have not only a good income, about 12% higher than other kinds of companies, research shows. They have about twice the retirement savings. So you go into a retirement, you have a little bit of Social Security income, but you have this hit of assets. It's kind of this cushion that you can use to protect yourself and take care of yourself. Now you're starting to have the foundation of economic security, financial stability. You can send a child to college, you can buy a home, you can weather a period of unemployment. Assets are foundational. There's a reason that every economy in the world has been a question of who owns the assets, who controls the assets. That's where the real power is. That's where the real security is. We're so beaten down in our society, we don't even think about ordinary people needing and having a right to own more assets.
Right.
It's just not even part of our mental map. Most people don't even know what an asset is. You know, back in the early days, there was among the early feminists working for the vote. It's even before then. In the very earliest days, when women would start to get there and talk about this radical idea of women's rights, somebody suggested, I'm not sure if it was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but someone of that stature suggested, well, you know, women should have the vote. And someone else said, who was equally radical, said, we can't go that far. It was considered just unimaginable, too far. And so can we imagine a society where ordinary people own most of the assets? Can we even begin to imagine that?
Yeah.
Why is that so hard to imagine? You know?
It's interesting.
Why isn't that our vision?
Right.
It's a very simple vision. And so why does worker ownership matter? Well, you know, it works today. It's a workable thing in today's economy. Like, you know, there's a worker-owned, 100% worker-owned company in rural Vermont. It's a Chroma technology. They make filters, high-tech filters for all kinds of industrial uses. And this is a place where today a worker with a high school education makes $100,000 a year. You know, if you're not extracting all the wealth and sending it to Wall Street, there's some left over.
Yeah.
And it can be used in different ways.
It reminds me, it kind of makes me want to ask a question about theory of change here. Because while you're talking, it occurs to me that kind of there seems to be a sense in our society, at least among some people, that there's, you know, that this isn't a system problem. These are individual problems. When someone doesn't have $400 in their pocket for a school uniform or something.
Sure.
There's this notion that that's not my problem. People are very hard on individuals, very soft on the system. And as an advocate for worker ownership, how do you think through, you know, enacting this change? Is it a matter of spreading awareness? Is it a matter of kind of, you know, building examples like the one you just cited, like look at this?
Sure.
Alternative institutions. How do you think about how we go about changing these notions?
Yeah, you know, this is something that we're thinking about collectively in this initiative that I've helped to launch. It's called 50 by 50. And the idea is employee ownership has been around, you know, 30, 40 years. It grew a lot. It's been stagnant for a couple of decades now. It hasn't grown a lot. And so a group of us got together and said, how would we catalyze employee ownership to go to scale? What if we had 50 million worker owners by the year 2050? That's about 5 times what we have today.
Wow. That
would make worker ownership bigger than manufacturing was in the 1980s. If you can remember that far back. Back when, you know, getting a good factory job was like this, was a great thing, and you could have, you know, you could have a good life.
They were also considered union jobs. They were considered, you know, there was a lot of protection. There was a safety net there.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So that, as we have seen, has declined. But employee ownership at 50 million would be bigger than that.
Yeah.
It would be a major part of the landscape. So how do you begin to get there? So we gathered 30 people, leading thinkers in this space, and also investors and city economic development and so forth. And we thought about this together for a couple of days, in addition to doing more than 50 interviews. And we put together, there's like maybe a half dozen interventions that would be most effective. One is awareness. Here I am talking to you about employee ownership. Employee ownership has been around for 40 years. There are more than 7,000 of these companies. And they employ more than 10 million people, and nobody's ever heard of it. Something's wrong with that picture.
Yeah.
Well, part of the picture is the Wall Street Journal. Part of the picture is all of our news is about investing, and it's about gains to capital. If you have a 100% employee-owned company, it's not a story about capital.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't get into the news. It's not. You can't invest in it. It's not news. You can invest in it, but that's a separate story. But okay, so awareness. So building awareness. We've started a blog among employee-owned experts. And here at the Democracy Collaborative, and we want to start an employee ownership news service. We want to start systematically feeding the stories out into the news. Okay, so that's one thing. Another thing is, what's the role of capital? I mean, companies need capital. This is not, you don't eliminate capital anymore. That when we have feminism, we don't eliminate men. You just change the power relationships. That's what you do. Mm-hmm. And so what's the role of capital? We have a couple of research projects looking at the role of capital in scaling up employee ownership. There are two firms. They're private equity firms that invest in employee ownership. One of them invests only in employee ownership conversions, converting companies to employee ownership. They're making returns of about 21%, which is private equity returns. And at the end of companies paying that out, then the workers own the company. And so there's a play there for investors. There's gain there for employees. That company ends up being locally owned, hopefully in perpetuity. So there's a lot of winners there, and so we want to promote that model. We think there should be dozens of these, not one firm doing this. Capital. That's another lever. Another lever is I think tools for practitioners. I mean, if you want to, right now, baby boom entrepreneurs are beginning to enter retirement. Mm-hmm. Baby boom entrepreneurs own 7 million companies. A lot of them are just tiny, but there are a lot of companies in there that could be potential for employee ownership conversion. Fewer than 10% of these plan to pass it to their kids. So what's going to happen to these companies? They'll close. They'll sell to a larger competitor. They'll sell to somebody outside the community. They'll move. A lot of them could be converted to employee ownership. Right. And so there's a movement for people starting state centers for employee ownership. We have state centers already in Ohio, Vermont, California, Pennsylvania. We ought to have these in every state. There's federal legislation that would help create centers in every state. The Ohio Employee Ownership Center over many years has created thousands of employee-owned jobs. I think 14,000 employee-owned jobs, and it's cost them about $500 per job. We just heard recently that Foxconn got $3 billion from the state of Wisconsin. They're going to create about 3,000 jobs. Well, that's $1 million a job. If we had a state center for employee ownership, they could do that for about $500 a job.
It's worth noting that Foxconn does not have a good reputation for being good jobs.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Their workers in China have been known to commit suicide, and they actually have nets around the company now just to catch the jumpers.
Yeah.
Employee-owned companies don't tend to be that way.
Yeah.
So those are some of the levers, but that's one of the things we actually are working with a network of people to identify the levers and to begin to pull those levers.
Right. So I do want to just circle back here. This project you're working on called 50 by 50, it's in partnership with the Democracy at Work Institute, the ICA group, and the National Center for Employee Ownership. How did this idea kind of come together? Building this network. Mm-hmm. What inspired these individuals to do?
Yeah, well, all of those groups have been experts in employee ownership for a long time.
Right.
our role, we thought, was more to sort of catalyze systemic change, and that's a lot what the Democracy Collaborative is about. We're trying to intervene in different ways to help catalyze systemic change. We thought this was one field that was ready to go to scale. Mm-hmm. It's the one new economy model that I think is most ready to go to scale.
Right.
And so we just naturally wanted to partner with the best people in the field, with the leaders in the field. ICA Group out of Massachusetts, they've been doing employee ownership conversions for decades, I believe. They're really highly sophisticated people. Democracy at Work Institute is all about scaling up worker ownership, which is one model of employee ownership. They're also doing fabulous work. And the National Center for Employee Ownership out of the Bay Area is one of the leading national groups in employee ownership. That both employee-owned companies themselves are members, and also the service providers. I was just out at their conference. They have more than 1,700 people at their annual conference, and so these are all powerful, sophisticated players. And a lot the way we work at 50 by 50 and at the Democracy Collaborative in general is tapping that kind of collective intelligence and working to get onto the same page and have working together on strategies to really take things to scale.
Is there, I mean, it occurs to me that setting this goal, which is very ambitious, 50 million worker owners by 2050, setting this goal now in what seems to be kind of a dark time, is there something about this political moment, or even this, we're almost 10 years out from the economic crash and what that did to working Americans? Is there something about this political moment that you think really resonates with this argument in this case for worker ownership?
I do think that. I think that people are hungry for solutions of what works. Mm-hmm. People are hungry to understand what's a different path in our economy that might work for ordinary people.
Yeah.
Ordinary people, like all of us, I'm an ordinary person, I just mean sort of the non-wealthy. People get that something's not right about the system. They get that it doesn't feel like it's working on our behalf.
Right.
But they don't understand exactly why or how to make it different. There's complicated arguments you can make, but this is something simple. It's something tangible. Like we can point to a company and say, look, here's a guy with a high school education making $100,000 a year.
Yeah.
It's not pie in the sky. This is reality. And so, yeah, we do perceive that the moment is right for this. And I'll give you an indication of that, Adam. And that is, you might remember about a year ago, Chobani, which is the big yogurt maker, the Hamdi. Forgive me, I don't.
Hamdi Bey.
Thank you. Yes. He gave about 10% of the company to his workers. And this was covered on NBC. And we were told that this was the most watched segment on NBC ever.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like the city's on fire while we're doing the interview.
It's an emergency. Yeah. We need employee ownership.
Yeah. The Chobani, it's interesting because not only were they moved to an ESOP model, if I'm not mistaken. No,
they didn't. He just gave the ownership directly to employees.
Great,
it's a different model.
Yeah, great. But not only that, there's a lot of kind of progressive-minded aspects of this company. I know that Hamdi Bey himself is involved quite a bit in kind of refugee resettlement and issues like that, and the company has made certain charitable donations. It's you should eat more Chobani yogurt, is what I'm saying.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
and Hamdi has ideas about how to make this easier for other companies to do. We're eager to talk with him about that. We haven't had a chance to do that yet, but I think the fact that people were just enlivened and just electrified by this example, that says a lot.
It seems like in the past year there have been examples like this that make news. I remember. I think I've seen a few articles about New Belgium Brewing and even other microbreweries. It is in some ways becoming very in vogue. Or not. I don't mean that in people are these fashionable people going for worker ownership.
Yeah.
but I mean,
I wish.
But I see stories connected to beers everyone drinks, and it seems to be coming into or yogurt people eat. That it seems to be coming into the consciousness in a new way recently, which I think is really profound.
Yeah, I think that's right. So New Belgium Brewing, they're part of the network of 50 by 50.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and we're delighted to get some support from them, and we've been out and met with them, and they started a trend among craft brewers to move to employee ownership. There's probably a half dozen craft brewers that are now employee owned. So that's one of the things we see as a possible scaling technique is sort of the contagion effect. It's, the coolness factor. This is a cool thing. It's starting to happen in solar companies too. Now, that being said, I will also add that far more craft brewers are being sold to Anheuser-Busch. And so a lot of, people should know a lot of those cool sounding craft beers that you are buying are actually owned by a big multinational.
Right.
So you might pay attention to that. We think it matters who owns the company. We think it will make for a more authentic mission over time.
Right. And before we move to my last question, I just want to ask, aside from Chobani and a few other examples, I know you do a lot of work kind of keeping your finger on the pulse of these types of movements. Are there bright spots you think people might not have heard of, or you'd encourage people to look into further about worker ownership and generative design?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I would encourage people to look, for example, at the movement for platform cooperatives. That's an emerging, I think, exciting area. How would it be different if we the people owned Google?
Yeah.
And there are some companies that are that way. Or what if we owned? I
know Twitter is the big.
There's a movement. There's a movement to think about Twitter. So that's cool. And there is there's a collective or a collaborative of photographers who have a company that they own jointly, and they have a platform to sort of sell their services. We can own these things. We don't have to be just, serfs of somebody else who's going to extract all the wealth. And once you realize you can do that, there are, these ride hailing services. There are some that have, I think it's Juno is one that half is owned by workers.
Right.
So much of this is possible if we just get it into our mental map.
Right.
You're also seeing a similar phenomenon happening with distributed energy. We don't need to have energy that's supplied to us by concentrated creators of energy who are owned by external shareholders. That's sort of an old industrial model.
Right.
We can have distributed energy where we start to own the solar on our own rooftop.
Right.
Or we have community solar. So I think there's a broad movement toward distributed ownership, which is, I think, a good model for new era.
I feel like when you really think about it, the notion that oil in the ground owns, so one company in particular owns that and they sell it to you is already kind of odd. But the notion that a company owns the sunlight and that they're then selling it to you becomes profoundly absurd, that you can't really deal with.
Well said.
Well, Marjorie, thank you for being on the program today. This is a very fun conversation. Is there anything else you'd like our listeners to know before we conclude today?
Well, just thanks for having me, and I just would encourage people to think about who owns the company that you're buying stuff from. It's a good thing to be aware of.
Absolutely. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on the Next System Podcast.
Thanks, Adam.